This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. I am your host, Darren McKee, and with me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Shut up or your face.
We have a great show for you today. I'm going to give you a short little book review on the book, The Technology Trap. But first, Adam is going to talk to us about coronal mass ejections. I assume this is his new band.
In March of this year, you probably heard about auroras being seen in many places on Earth. Though the auroras are usually seen far up north on the globe, they can occur further south when the solar winds which cause them are more intense. What I haven't seen reported on quite as much is the risk associated with this kind of event, the kind of catastrophes we might have averted. So it's a bit of a running gag in our annual prediction show that I make a prediction that there will be a solar event which will cause significant damage to equipment on half of the planet facing the sun at the time. It's sort of a joke, but it's also something I'm legitimately terrified will happen in my lifetime. So it seems like we recently had a pretty close call, but it's difficult to tell exactly how dangerous or how close that call was. I wanted to kind of look into that and investigate it and talk about why I'm always saying this and what I'm really worried about. So what happened? On March 12th at 11:36 p.m. Eastern Time, a coronal mass ejection occurred on the side of the sun facing away from the Earth. So I saw some conflicting reports on the specifics of this, but some sources I saw pretty much said that if this had been on the other side, it would have been 10 to 100 times as strong as the 1859 Carrington event, which I'll discuss in a moment. Another source said it would have been Carrington level, but that we don't have specific measurements to know that precisely. So we don't actually know how bad that Carrington event was. Astrophysicist Dr. C. Alex Young of suntoday.org said that the coronal mass ejection's speed of 3,000 kilometers per second was, and I quote, as fast if not faster than the fastest CME, like the famous Carrington event. Could be the big one for the cycle, but we have to wait. A NASA blog mentioned that they measured the speed of the ejection at 2,127 kilometers per second, which is a bit less, but it's still in the same ballpark. It's still very fast, very potentially bad. So it kind of sounds like this event, which faced away from the Earth, but still resulted in auroras that were seen much further south than usual, could have been very extreme if it had hit the Earth. But what does that mean? What's going on when this happened? So the sun is a massive ball of hot ionized gases. It is all the time. There's pressure for that hot gas to expand, which is countered by the sun's strong gravity, which holds it more or less stable and together most of the time. The current of the sun's gases can cause inconsistencies in the magnetic field. Some gases are prevented from rising to the surface, causing a sunspot, which to us is seen as a slightly darker, cooler spot on the surface of the sun. The magnetic field lines uncoil and the gas rises to the surface, and sometimes this creates enough pressure leading to a solar flare, which is hot gas flying away from the sun's surface, causing visible and invisible radiation, which is mostly absorbed by the Earth's atmosphere. Not a huge deal. But a coronal mass ejection is more serious. So this is when a large portion of the sun's surface expands rapidly and ejects a significant amount of particles into space. A coronal mass ejection produces a magnetic shockwave billions of miles into space, and if the Earth is in the path of that shockwave when it occurs, it can cause the alignment of the Earth's magnetic field to shift unpredictably.
And just to clarify, the Earth is 150 million kilometers away from the sun, so clearly within that range.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong effect. So we get nice lights in the sky, no big deal, but it can also create an electric current in large conductors such as those found in the electrical grid. That might be a problem. Now let's go back to 1859, the one that worries me, or the thing that happened that makes me think if it happened again, it's bad news. So this event, known as the Carrington event, was likely caused by a coronal mass ejection, but we didn't have the tools to measure it then that we have today, evidently. Auroras were seen as far south as Cuba, Mexico, Queensland, Hawaii, southern Japan, China, and Colombia. Compasses and telegraph systems failed. The telegraph lines even gave operators electric shocks. Some telegraph pylons threw sparks. Evidently, the world was not as connected in 1859 as it is now. We have luckily not had a similar event since, but one could happen anytime. A less severe event in 1989 caused power outages across Quebec, which is where I currently live. A Carrington-class coronal mass ejection occurred in 2012, but it missed the Earth. Okay, so there's always a chance, even the one that was on the other side of the Earth. Depends exactly where it's oriented. It's hard to tell if similar such events occurred earlier in history because there was just no infrastructure to be affected. Some study of carbon-14 in tree rings was done to try to uncover evidence of prior events, and this suggested that events around the year 774 or 775 and the years 993 and 994, Common Era, were earlier events that were potentially about 10 times worse than the 1859 Carrington event. Further, an event from about 7,176 BCE seemed to be even greater than that.
Nice.
So, Carrington event would be bad. 10 times plus Carrington event, really terribly devastating.
Especially if you had no sense of what was happening. I think if it happened now, most of us would feel that way. But, if people listen to our podcast and get the segment, they'd be like, oh, okay, the sun did something. Right?
Yeah, all of a sudden you would there'd be a power outage and it'd be like, that's funny. There's no storm.
No,
and then you slowly realize oh, it's really bad. My phone doesn't even turn on,
Yeah, I was getting to before there was electricity, there would just be God's wrath or something.
Oh,
right?
yeah. You would just, I guess in that case, it would just be weird lights in the sky. Maybe we should sacrifice a lamb or something, right?
Oh, you're right. Maybe it would actually just be pretty. There wouldn't actually be as much harm if you didn't have the electric infrastructure.
Yep. So what is it I am so afraid of? And am I being paranoid or are my fears really justified? I'm not sure I have a fully perfect answer to that. Now, there isn't consensus on the exact impact, and it would depend on the severity of the event. So here are some scenarios. A 2021 Wired article suggests that such an event could cause an internet apocalypse. The article highlights the known risk to electrical grids and potential blackouts. It also gets into a presentation by Sanjita Abdou-Ghiathi of the University of California, Irvine, titled Solar Superstorms, Planning for an Internet Apocalypse, which details the potential impact. So one silver lining for internet infrastructure mentioned is that fiber optics, which work by sending light through a fiber optic cable, would not be affected by electromagnetic interference. So that infrastructure, which is what I have coming into my living room, it's what a lot of people use for internet, some of the backbone for the internet, would not be affected, would be spared. The large risk she outlined was to long undersea cables which run between continents. So some of those are fiber optic as well, but they have repeaters which could be impacted by such an event. If these are impacted, entire countries would be cut off from the rest of the internet, even if the local networks were fine. Now, the internet is meant to be resilient to cut links, but if enough damage occurred, it would cause issues with a border gateway protocol, and that's what was involved in last year's Rogers outage in Canada. That's something I talked about on the show. It could affect DNS, domain name systems, which is necessary to basically resolve a website to an IP address. So if DNS isn't working, not much is going to work on your web browser, your phone, whatever. She also said that we have a limited understanding of what the damage could be. So satellites are particularly vulnerable since they don't have the Earth's atmosphere to protect them. And this could also affect things like GPS. Electrical grids are vulnerable, and while some are made to be resistant to impacts, solar events are so rare that they may not be equipped to handle this particular kind of issue. We don't have a regular baseline of this kind of event to compare to. How Stuff Works mentioned that it would induce electricity in any large conductor, which includes power transformers and the grid itself. So power lines could sag and snap. Radio signals and other communication could be affected, but that would be temporary. And they estimate that it could take weeks or months to repair damages. Power outages happen, sure, but what if they happen simultaneously in major cities in half the globe, maybe even more than that? That would be a big deal. I worry less about my phone working than I do about whether or not the grocery store shelves will be stocked and whether I would have the ability to use my money to buy from them. Who's sending aid if everyone needs the aid at once?
Oh, boy.
So this source says that individual electronic devices, phones and computers would probably not short out. We don't know for sure as it depends on the intensity, but this seems less likely than the bigger risk, which is breakdown of infrastructure. In June 2013, researchers at Lloyd's of London looked at the risk and potential cost of damage, which they estimated to be between $600 billion and $2.6 trillion just in the US.
Wow.
Oh.
So that's between 3.6 and 15.5% of the US GDP. They suggest that such an event could occur roughly every 150 years. So that kind of makes sense. Carrington event was a bit more than that ago. They estimated the US population risk to extended power outage is between 20 and 40 million people, and between 16 days and 1 to 2 years.
Oof.
Yeah. So, what can we do?
I would say, could anything be done?
So globally, there are ways to harden equipment against an EMP, solar event, something like that. But it costs money. Redundancies in these systems would certainly help. Data backups that are shielded would be valuable, assuming they can be restored to something. Like it doesn't matter if you've got a backup if all your computers are fried. Backing them up on the other side of the planet might be a good idea. Those solar events could affect more than just the half of the planet facing the sun, depending exactly what's going on, how long it lasts, and other factors. What can you as an individual person do about this? A Faraday cage is probably your best option. So this is basically a box of metal which causes the electromagnetic interference to pass through the metal around the contents inside. So the inside of the box needs to be insulated from the metal, or it could cause damage to the equipment when the charge runs through the outer magnetic shell, and basically there's a charge in it. It would just shock the electronics. So a metal box lined with thick cardboard, rubber, styrofoam, something like that would do it. The intensity of the solar event will dictate how thick the metal and insulation would need to be. So wrapping a cardboard box in aluminum foil may be enough for something mild. But if it's a really big one, it might get through that. Now, a couple of years ago, when a solar event was a possibility, I put some electronics in the microwave to shield them. But it's not a perfect Faraday cage, and there are gaps in the seal. So it likely would provide some protection, but not as much as some alternatives. So I think an older microwave was really made as a Faraday cage. The newer ones are not necessarily Faraday cages. So microwaves are made to stop wavelengths of 2.45 gigahertz from escaping the oven's frame. However, something like an EMP or an electromagnetic radiation caused by a coronal mass ejection is broad spectrum. So some of those frequencies may be able to penetrate the cage. So you wouldn't get specific wavelengths of microwaves getting in, but other ones may be able to. So there's probably some protection from that, but it's not perfect. An old microwave might work perfectly, though. Converting existing items can work too. For example, a filing cabinet, when properly insulated, can be a good Faraday cage, but it depends on some specifics. So this may require modification. Some filing cabinets may not have a metal bottom, or they might have some gaps, which aren't metal. So if there's like some rubber or something like that, you'll need a wire installed to allow the current to go around it. So you kind of have to short around that rubber piece. A metal garbage can do the job if you line it with cardboard or something non-conductive, though the lid would need to be sealed with something like metal tape or something like that to ensure there's no gaps. In a pinch, you can even just put the electronics in a bag and put that in the metal container. So if you put like a laptop in a laptop bag and just put that in a metal garbage bin, that would probably provide some pretty good protection. Having something behind something like a thick layer of concrete is useful, but it's not necessarily all that practical for everyone to do.
Well, even metal garbage bins, like, was this the 90s? The 80s?
Yeah,
exactly.
Oscar the Grouch bin is totally what I was thinking. I was like, I could buy an Oscar the Grouch garbage bin.
Yeah, at a different time, my friend. I guess you could find a dumpster. Is also something.
Oh, no. I bought garbage bins like that at IKEA a few years ago. You can still buy those. They're like trendy and
oh, yes, retro
hipstery.
Garbage.
Yeah, they're popular. So one way of looking at it is if you're in a place where you don't get any cell reception, it's probably a decent indicator that you wouldn't be affected by an EMP or potentially a coronal mass ejection, right? So the cell phone signal isn't getting through because it's being blocked by like a bunch of concrete, a bunch of wood or whatever in the building. If you're in a basement or something like that, basements, parking garage, subway tunnels, things like that, these are decent places to be or to keep your stuff if you don't want it to get wrecked. On an earlier show, I covered the idea shown in the film Terminator Dark Fate that you could block a cell phone signal with a bag of chips. Turns out it doesn't work, but like 3 bags of chips actually did it. It worked well enough. So something like this could help, probably against a weak electromagnetic field, but not a terribly strong one. But, maybe if you put like 10 bags of chips, it would be okay.
Surrounded by chips. I had to do it.
So a simple way to protect a phone might be to put in a thick insulated envelope, wrap it with a few layers of aluminum foil or something like that. That's probably like if you want your phone protected from actual cell signals, that's a way to do it too. There are other things which make electronics more or less vulnerable to being damaged. When something is plugged in and has power running through it, it's more vulnerable. Unplugging and turning off your devices will protect them somewhat, so they'll be more resistant. It depends on the strength again. So if we knew there was a massive amount of solar activity that could cause an event on Earth, we could shut down parts of the grid to minimize or avoid the damage, right? If the solar activity was so intense, someone might decide, you know what, we can go without power for 2 days it's better than losing it for 2 years.
Yeah, I was going to ask that, how much of a warning we'd get. Because it's not like, if the sun, something happens to the sun, 8.3 minutes later, we just have problems. But with this stuff, as you said, there may be enough activity that's a precursor event.
Yeah. So my understanding is the coronal mass ejection, the ejection itself takes quite a while. It's like 2 or 3 days to reach the Earth. That's what causes the auroras. But the electromagnetic shockwave itself is the speed of light. Right. So I think
it just happens.
There's not much to do, but you can tell by the surrounding solar activities how likely that might be, right? So there are agencies that monitor this, and you can get alerts for it. Sorry, I don't have the links for them off the top of my head, but there's places you can go and you can get like a text message if like there's a risk of a solar event, right?
Just imagining being told to not stare at the sun and someone does that for their job.
Probably be wearing glasses or something.
Well, yeah, through computers, of course. I'm being silly.
Now, a surge protector will help protect devices from an electrical surge. So a surge on the power infrastructure, right? That could cause a surge in the wires in your home, which could cause a surge in your devices, which could fry your devices. So if you got a surge protector, that would protect somewhat against it. Just having your stuff unplugged would help too. A coiled up wire will amplify the electrical interference. So even if your laptop wasn't plugged in, but you've got that wire coiled up, maybe that electromagnetic interference creates enough of a current in the cable that will shock your computer. So the solution is that snaking it sort of in an S or a zigzag pattern will lower the electrical field on the wire. So basically, the bits of wire that are next to each other kind of cancel themselves out because the field is kind of alternating like that. So it's a little complicated, but that's, if you're really worried about it, that's something you could do. Or you just not have the wire connected to your device. As with any risk, you really need to weigh the likelihood versus the potential impact and the cost of mitigating it. I think the likelihood of this is decent. The impact is massive. And the cost to mitigate is something we should be prioritizing. I don't think people are worried about this enough. I think most people aren't worried about it as much as me.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's going to do any of those things. They're just
I bought some chips.
Well, it's one of these and if you do a good job and it just doesn't happen, it's like, what did you do? Or if you do a good job and it does occur and nothing happens, then you don't really get the recognition for it. Unless if there was like a city had a really good setup and everyone else lost power but them, they would obviously get kudos. But disaster recovery is this complicated thing that a lot of people just don't necessarily prioritize.
It sure is. And, politically, socially, it's very hard for people to evaluate the quality of a decision independent of an outcome. Because you can have good decisions that lead to bad outcomes and bad decisions that end up being good outcomes due to luck or whatnot. And, I'm also concerned about low probability, high impact events.
Yeah.
So one could think if we just did a little bit of that, ounce of prevention, we'd get all these pounds of cure, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that just the problem is the prevention in this case is costly. Yeah. Right. For the severity, and I think the likelihood is high since like Carrington event wasn't that long ago, right? Less than 200 years, a little over 150.
I would happily get a text saying there's a 50% chance of a coronal mass ejection in the next week.
Yeah, and then you would just, I don't know, put your stuff downstairs, put in a box. You could do those quick things. If you knew maybe a day ahead of time, you could do a lot.
Yeah.
I feel like people are more worried about zombies than, than that happening.
That's another way to look at it. To be generally prepared for an emergency will help.
Yeah.
Right? Like, do you have food and water for a couple weeks? Do you have these things? Like, maybe some of the backup things that you have might not work if this is really severe, but, being generally prepared for an emergency is good. And I'm not going to get into all those specifics, but doing a lot of those things, having less reliance on technology, having less of a reliance on computer systems is generally useful. These are useful tools. We should use them, but don't depend on them for your life.
Yeah, I fully support this. People should have food and water for a couple days, and many people don't.
A solar event of the equivalent severity of the Carrington event will happen. It's a question of when. Whether or not that occurs in our lifetime isn't something I could predict, but if you're relatively young, there's a good chance that it could. The impact of this kind of event would be widespread and costly, even if we don't know some of the specifics now. The things that can be done to mitigate the most severe impacts aren't really something the average person can do, unless they have a lot of influence over, say, power companies and elected officials. But there are some steps you can take to protect your home and your devices. Be safe.
Thanks, Adam.
Adam, you get snaps for that.
And now I'm going to do a short book review. The book is The Technology Trap, subtitled Capital, Labor, and Power in the Age of Automation by Carl Benedikt Frey. So I thought this was an excellent book, and it provides a detailed history of technology and employment during the Industrial Revolution all the way up to the present. And here you go, nice publisher's blurb. From the Industrial Revolution to the Age of Artificial Intelligence, this book takes a sweeping look at the history of technological progress and how it has radically shifted the distribution of economic and political power among society's members. So the Industrial Revolution created unprecedented wealth and prosperity over the long run, but the immediate consequences of mechanization were devastating for large swaths of the population. Middle-income jobs withered, wages stagnated, and the labor share of income fell. Profits surged and economic inequality skyrocketed. These trends, Frey documents, broadly mirror those in our current age of automation, which began with the computer revolution. So I can be honest, and this book is probably not quite what everyone is looking for, but I really enjoyed the analysis and insights. And I say probably not for everyone because it is a bit detailed in certain cases about economics and whatnot, as well as technology and historical development. But I thought the detail really helped make the case. I'm also now far more sympathetic to the Luddites. When I hear Luddites, oh, those Luddites, it's like, you know what? They actually had a decent case. They lost their jobs. They themselves did not benefit from automation. So back then, if you were the one put out of work and you protested, you could go to jail.
Really?
Back then, people were put to death because they destroyed some machines. It was a different time because the machines were thought so important to economic, survivability and progress and everything else.
Wow.
That's extreme.
Yes,
though.
it is. Exactly. Florence and her machines. So I also thought, well, he's making the case that sometimes people benefited, but they were generations later or different groups of people. So it is the case that some people lose and some people win. And sometimes we think of it in our modern age, like, well, that's what happens. There's winners and losers. But you could say that's what happened to a lot of working class people over the past decades with manufacturing going offshore and different types of robotics and automation affecting other types of manufacturing work.
Well, and that's really easy retrospectively, but when you're one of the winners or the losers, it's a different story, right?
Of course. And the idea that, in the past, because of the way the world was structured, way before the Industrial Revolution, of course, many people could do many types of jobs if they were, healthy and mobile. And then with the Industrial Revolution at the beginning, if you were, again, decently mobile and sufficiently healthy, you could do different types of work because it was not so specialized. But as things become more specialized, it's not that easy to retrain for something else, right? But you could go from one physical labor job to another physical labor job to even a factory job to a different factory job. And now it's like, well, those factories are getting more complicated. The robots that really, put the cars together, that's a very different type of thing that we're in. So it's still uncertain whether ongoing automation will lead to unemployment in a bad way in our time. But this time does seem different to me because there's nowhere else to go. And that's what I was referencing when I thought, well, people can just keep kind of shifting to the next job. Meaning people can't upskill enough as eventually AI can probably do it all. And this really will seem to depend on how long robotics takes and of course, or whether consumers will demand made by humans products. You'll have a job of just making clothing for dogs because people want, I want a human to make my dog's clothing. I'll pay for that. And, there's mechanical non-routine work, which I think is probably the hardest for an AI to do, like say physiotherapy or maybe electrician that goes to people's homes because there's so much variability in homes and electrical, especially old wiring. That would seem very difficult. What can I do that an AI robot can't? And I think that just keeps shrinking.
Even things that I thought 5 years ago were some of the last things to go, the AI can already do. It's very hard to predict. The AI can actually be a doctor pretty easily, but not a nurse. I might have thought the other way around, but okay, well, we'll just adapt to that. But what do you do if you're in school right now? What do you concentrate on?
Yes, you have my sympathies, right? Because many people thought the creative stuff will be the last. Yeah. And it turns out that's some of the first. Because there's enough patterns, there's enough data, right, for this stuff that you can churn it out. For people who are in school, I don't know what I'm sort of telling people that I know have kids. It's try to focus on soft skills as well as higher order interpersonal stuff and or possibly a trade, right?
Yeah, something I'll have to
Yeah,
figure
it's
out.
so fascinating because, I mean, even like, could an AI replace a translator at the UN? Why not?
Easily.
Oh, that seems like one of the most
easily.
Yeah.
I'm really blown away by the language abilities of these AI systems. That I thought that would not happen till later.
Yeah. Or to Christina's case, like it could be that it's very hard to replace a very skilled UN translator, but for people who can't afford the full translator and they're willing to deal with 90% good, like, okay, we'll take the free thing or the one that's $10 a month. Thanks for joining us once again, listeners. We heard about coronal mass injections and how automation might come for us all. Great podcast. Uplifting.
The coronal mass ejection is going to wipe out the AIs that's starting to enslave us. And if it's timed perfectly,
yes, that's a good point.
Then we'll be able to rebuild in a different way that avoids a repeated sort of AI takeover.
I think I need a new subchapter in my book.
Adam, you know humans never learn from anything.
No, for sure, because I would be the guy who's there like, oh, screw these rules. I'm going to like circumvent it and I'm going to make my AI anyway. And I'm going to try to get an advantage. And a lot of people are probably less conscious about other people than me, so they're going to be like much more cutthroat about it. So yeah, it would be short, but maybe we'll get a few years from that.
Adam turns his whole basement into a Faraday cage. Just hanging out with my robot pal. We're gonna play video games. What's the problem? Don't worry about it. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smartassy.
It's a not so bad. It's a nicer place.
I don't get the reference.
I don't get it
Shut
either.
up in your face.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @TRC_podcast.